Is all right? And apparently we don't have audio, but you can hear me in the back okay. So I'll try to keep it this level. No? How many engineers does it take to turn on a microphone? Let me, first of all, thank you for taking some time out. I gather this is the time when you are also taking exams. And also the expo is coming, and so everything is crazy. And so I appreciate a little bit of time with you. I'm going to try to answer the questions that Jose Luis has synthesized, but let me just spend a few minutes on what is happening to the internet. If you are following any of the statistics, you'll notice that over 500 million users of the internet now are in Asia. This is a big number compared with what it was 10 years ago. In fact, a couple of weeks ago, the Chinese population on the internet exceeded the US population on the internet. And that was quite a big surprise for the Americans. There are about 250 million Chinese online, about 500 million Asians, so a lot of them are also from India and Japan and Indonesia, Malaysia, and so on. No? No? How's that? That works. So do I attach this to my left nostril?
Does this
Okay.
work now?
Is that working?
Yes.
Okay, good. So it turns out that we're seeing very rapid change in the demographics on the network. Another phenomenon is an increasing amount of use on the net by way of mobiles. I'm sure you all have one kind or another. This is an old BlackBerry. But this is significant because a lot of users of the internet are going to first have an experience with internet services through a mobile and not through a laptop. So we have to adapt our products and our services at Google and elsewhere to work through these mobiles. And it's not an easy challenge. I mean, this has a display area the size of a 1928 television set, and a keyboard that's suitable for people that are 3 inches tall. So there's a lot of work to be done to make this a comfortable way of getting access to internet information. If you carry your information window on your hip, the kind of information that you look for changes from very general searching to searching for information which is relevant to where you are. So a small example, when I was on a vacation with my wife last year, literally a year ago, in the United States, we went to a place called Lake Powell. It's a big lake in the state of Arizona. There's a little town called Page, Arizona, which is near to the lake. And you can rent a houseboat, for example, and go off for a few days. So as we were driving into this little town of Page, Arizona, the question was, what kind of meals should we prepare while we're on the boat? Because when you finally get on the boat, there are no grocery stores on the lake, so you have to take everything with you. So she said, why don't we make some paella? And I like this, but I thought, well, where are we going to find saffron to make paella in this tiny little town of Page, Arizona? But as we were driving down the highway, I saw I was getting a good GPRS signal. So I brought up the Google search page and I searched for saffron, Page, Arizona grocery store. And it came back with several choices, telephone numbers, and little maps. So I clicked on the telephone number and the phone rang. And somebody on the other end said hello, and I said, may I speak to the spice department, please? This is probably a tiny little store. It's probably the owner of the store. And he says, this is the spice department. I said, well, do you have any saffron? And he says, I don't know, but I'll go look. And he came back and said yes. So then we followed the map to get to the store. Now this is all happening literally in real time. And I dash into the store and I buy $12.99 worth of saffron. That's 0.06 ounces, in case you care. And then we went off and we made a nice paella on the boat. The thing that struck me was that I was able to get information in real time that was significant to the locale where I was. It could have told me, oh yes, you can get saffron in New York City, but that's 1,500 miles away. I needed to know where could I get saffron nearby. So this idea of indexing information by its geography is extremely valuable, especially when you are carrying your information window with you at all times. So at Google, we're seeing a very powerful use of geographically indexed information, increasingly over time in Google Maps and in Google Earth. We're also seeing the same value of correlating information geographically in the scientific world. So if you have sensor systems that are physically located in different places and you want to correlate information from multiple sensors, you can show their location in Google Earth, and then when you click on the icon for each sensor, a window opens up and you can get information about what that sensor is seeing. You could remotely control the sensors, you can gather the data and analyze it and present it in a coherent way. So this geographical indexing is becoming very important. The other phenomenon that we're seeing on the net is an increasing amount of access at high speeds. And one of the questions that came up this morning in some discussions with your colleagues is how well are we doing here in Zaragoza and more generally in Spain to get broadband access to the network? And my impression is it's growing. I think you said 30% penetration throughout Spain. I hope it's higher here in Zaragoza, but I don't know. So we're seeing more mobile access, we're seeing more broadband access. I don't know if you have this problem here, but we have a big problem with broadband in the United States. This gets to the policy questions that Jose Luis mentioned. In the United States, there are not very many suppliers of broadband service. You can get broadband from the cable companies using cable modems. You can get broadband from the telephone companies with digital subscriber loops or with optical fiber. But that's it. And not everyone has a choice of all three. Sometimes you have a choice of one. Sometimes you have a choice of zero, because there may be no broadband available. So we have a big problem that there is not too much choice. And when you don't have very much choice, then you don't have competition. And when you don't have competition, you have people trying to control what people do with their broadband access to the net. They try to monetize everything, and they try to suppress competition for applications at higher levels. Example, if you supply fiber to someone at home and you also want to offer streaming video service, you could say, well, I want to make my video service look better than anyone else's. And so if someone else in the internet, anywhere in the world, is trying to provide a streaming video service, I won't give them as good quality as I give my own service. This is anti-competitive. And there's tension right now, not only in the United States, but in other parts of the world where a similar lack of competition exists. So one part of my job at Google is to visit various administrations to talk about regulation and to talk about using regulation to keep the network open and neutral. The reason that's so important is that all of the interesting services on the network are coming from the edges of the net and often coming from the users of the net. Google, for example, was started by 2 graduate students at Stanford 10 years ago. The interesting thing about what they did is that they did not have to get permission from anyone to try out their service on the network. They just put the service up on the hosts and made it available to anyone. The same is true of Yahoo, the same is true of Skype, and eBay, and Amazon, and all of the other services. So this openness, this neutrality is very important because it encourages people to try out new ideas. And if you try to control the system, and say, I'm sorry, you don't get to have access to the broadband unless you pay me extra, you really inhibit the evolution of the net. So openness and neutrality are really important. The only other thing I wanted to mention, well, one technical thing and one policy. The technical thing is that the network is going to run out of unique addresses somewhere around 2010. The address space that is currently used in the net is called IP version 4, and it was standardized around 1977 or 1978. It only has 32 bits of address space, and that's my fault. In 1977, we had a big argument for a year. How big should the network address space be? Now remember, the original design was done in 1973. By 1977, it's an experiment. We don't know if this is going to work. And we can't decide, the engineers and scientists who are working on this can't decide how much address space do you need. My reaction when I'm in the Defense Department at this point, paying the bills, is to say, if you can't make up your mind, I will choose, you only need 32 bits, 4.3 billion terminations is enough for an experiment. What I didn't know is the experiment wasn't going to stop. It's, just kept going. So here we are in 2008. And we are predictably going to run out of unique address space by 2010 or so. People are using artificial techniques like network address translation and private address space, non-routable address space, in order to give the impression of more addresses. But it's a terrible architectural solution. I don't like NAT boxes at all. So IP version 6 has 128 bits of address space. That's 3.4 times 10 to the 38, which is enough addresses to last until after I'm dead, and then it's someone else's problem. So I'm pushing very hard, as are many of my colleagues, to get the IPv6 up and running in the internet in parallel with IPv4. And Google, by the way, has already initiated an IPv6 search engine. It's ipv6.google.com. And if you have native IPv6 address to the internet and you go to that domain name, you will get v6 access to the Google search engine. We still have a lot of things to do to scale that up and to put all of our other services up on the net, but we're moving in that direction. And I'm encouraging all the other internet service providers and application providers to implement v6 as well. Then there was a policy issue that I wanted to raise as well. The internet is a very powerful tool, but it's kind of like a sword that has two edges. You can use it for very constructive things, and you can also use it for very destructive things. So spam and denial of service attacks, viruses and worms and Trojan horses, all kinds of abusive behavior on the network. These are all bad things that people do, in addition to the good things they do. And it's almost impossible to stop that kind of bad behavior. There are some technical things that we could do to suppress the ability to do denial of service attacks. People have tried to get rid of spam. That's turned out to be pretty hard. So on a global scale, we're going to have to find ways not necessarily to stop people, but to detect bad behavior. And it's not any different than other technologies. For example, in the Postal Service, which has been around for quite a long time, it's possible to commit fraud. And in most countries, fraud is illegal. They don't say, we can stop you from committing fraud, because they can't. But they say, if we catch you committing fraud, then there will be consequences. It's kind of like drinking and driving in the car. If you run into somebody and they detect that you were drunk while you were driving, they couldn't stop you from getting drunk, but they can certainly do something to you if they catch you. So internet is going to be like that. The problem is that it's global. And so we are going to have to discover what rules of behavior we are willing to tolerate and what behavior we are not willing to tolerate on a global scale. Then we're going to have agreements from country to country about enforcing the rules. There's a lot of tension here. because the internet is a very open environment. In many parts of the world, including my own country, freedom of speech is really important. It means sometimes you have to listen to people's speech that you don't like. But the suppression of speech by the state is not acceptable, at least in the United States and in many other parts of the world. So there's a tension here about what people can and can't do. And part of the political and policy side of my work is to try to find a place where there can be agreement on what's acceptable and what isn't. Privacy is another example, an area of great sensitivity. People put information on the net which puts them at risk of identity theft, for example. If we put health records online about your visits to the doctor, whatever diagnoses there are, that's private information. And yet you want it to be in one place so that the doctors can find it when they need it, but you don't want other people to find it. And so figuring out how to enforce that is both technically difficult and also depends on policy and multilateral agreements. Okay, so that's just sort of a preamble about what the state of the world is like. There are 9 questions here, which could take a while to answer, and I also want to make sure that I add a 10th one.
Oh, well, just pick out the ones you like the best.
Okay, well, I mean, I'm happy to work my way through here. Did you put them in any particular order?
No.
No, they just sort of whatever they were. Okay.
Well, they are grouped by subjects.
Yeah, okay.
You can jump from one to another, of course.
All right, I just realized you got interplanted on number 4, so that's good. I want to talk about that. All right, so let's start. First question. In languages based in non-Latin alphabets, web pages are growing exponentially. How is Google facing multilingual search? This is a really interesting problem for us. We have a big group of search experts that are studying various ways of doing search in a large number of languages, at least 90 by this time. What we're discovering is that some languages are harder than others to do search in. For example, Korean and Chinese have the property that when you write the text, there are not any natural breaks between words. It's kind of like the old way of writing Greek and Latin, where there were no breaks between words. You had to know the language to know where the boundaries are between words. And so this is called the segmentation problem. Because when you're doing the kind of search that Google does, you need to index the contents of the network. And to index it intelligently, you need to know which words are present on the page, which means you have to be able to have a computer read the text, break the text into words, index every word, and then use the index to help people find web pages that are of interest. So we found ourselves investing very heavily in the segmentation problem for languages like Chinese and Korean. We also discovered that we needed to do some heavy localization work for Eastern European languages. For example, Russian has 6 cases, and when you're doing a search for a term, you need to automatically add all the various case endings in order to correctly index and find the text that you're looking for, because that base word may be present in the text with different endings. And it took some time for us to fully automate that process for Russian and the Slavic languages, Czech, and so on. So on the whole, I think Google is doing very well with these multiple language search techniques. We're also working very hard to do translations. This is really tough. Many years ago, the computer science world had as its ultimate goal the ability to translate automatically from one language to another. I was around during the 1960s, and I remember there's a word called hubris. It means you think you can do more than you really can. And there was a belief then that if you just took the French dictionary and the Russian dictionary and the Spanish dictionary and the English dictionary and you poured them into the computer, it would help automatically translate. Well, you know the jokes that come out. Like we tried one time to take an English language expression out of sight, out of mind, which basically means if they're not there, you don't think about them. We translated that into Russian. Then we translated it back. And it came back, invisible idiot. Said, okay, something was lost in the translation there. So it's not so simple. And then we went through a period of time with believing there might be a deep structure that you could extract from natural language. This was Noam Chomsky's idea. That didn't really work out very well either. So the most recent and much more successful attempts have been taking texts that have been translated by human beings that are supposed to be identical. So a text in English and Spanish and French and German and Russian and Chinese, all translated by human beings, are then examined statistically to find phrases that appear to match. And if you have a large corpus of documents that are purported to be the same in the different languages, you can use statistics to do very, very good quality translation. So Google is moving more in that direction than in the deep structured grammatical path. The only other thing to add here is that the general way in which content is put on the net today with HTML and XML is to use the Unicode tables for the scripts in which these languages are written. And so the net itself, the web anyway, has a very good facility for representing many different languages. The domain name system, on the other hand, has been restricted forever to just the letters A through Z and the digits 0 through 9 and the hyphen. That's called LDH for letters, digits, and hyphen. That was the only kind of expression we had for domain names. During my time as the chairman of ICANN and now as the chairman of the working group for internationalized domain name standards in the Internet Engineering Task Force, my job is to help my colleagues standardize on the representation of domain names in scripts other than Latin. And without going into a lot of detail, it's turning out to be really, really quite hard because there are languages like, languages written in Latin, Greek, and Russian have letters that look the same. They don't mean the same thing, but they look the same. For example, something that looks like, how do you say it in eche? H in English, or it's how do you say it? Eche. So that looks like the letter H in English and Spanish, but that's an N in Russian. And so the problem here is that people could register domain names that look like something else and cause confusion because you think you're going to this site, but it just happens to be registered in Russian, only you didn't know that. So you think you're going over here to a Spanish site or an English language site, and you go to the wrong place. That's called phishing. And it can be quite damaging because they could say, hello, this is your local bank. Could I have your username and your password? Oh, sorry, there was a little connection problem here that will redirect you over to the real site. In the meantime, they now have your username and password, and they use that to empty out your bank account. So this is a fairly hard problem to do the right thing with the non-Latin scripts, and that's on its way. By the end of this year, we will have standards for doing non-Latin domain names. Okay, next question. Related to this matter, populations with a language based on the Latin alphabet are interacting by using English and to some extent Spanish as a lingua franca, but nowadays Chinese or Arabic are by no means in the neighborhood of Occidental countries. Are those based on non-Latin alphabets interacting in the same way, and are languages creating separated de facto internets? Well, the honest answer is yes. If you do not share a common language, it's very hard to communicate. Google tries to help when you do searches and you pull up a page of a language that you don't speak. We can try to do the translation using statistical methods, but the translations are always a little weak. And I'm sure you've amused yourself from time to time by looking at what happens when you translate things from one language into Spanish. And you know that it doesn't make too much sense sometimes. So there's a natural segregation of communities of common language speakers. That will always be the case. Perhaps in the future we will be able to translate better and maybe translate in real time. And so one very attractive possibility is to have instant messaging or Twitter or some of the other applications where you're typing in Spanish and the other person on the other side is reading in Chinese and typing in Chinese, and it's being translated in real time. I think we have some really serious research to do still to make that effective. It's already bad enough that we can have misunderstandings in the same language when we're dealing with written communication. And so in different languages, you can imagine it could get even worse. I don't find that to be I'm not disturbed by the fact that we separate ourselves into communities who speak different languages. That's normal. There's nothing magic about the internet in that regard. But it does offer, for the first time, the chance for a computer to be in between you and the people you're communicating with, where we can take advantage of the computing power to help facilitate the communication. Whereas before that, we would have to have a human being like Jose Luis here to do the translation. Okay.
I can read it for you, so you can rest for a while talking.
Oh, okay, but I don't mind.
Oh. Well,
You want to read it? Unless you want to translate it into Spanish
No, you
again.
won't.
This would be funny. He translated it from Spanish into English, and now you want to translate back into Spanish again.
no, I don't.
Okay.
Just
don't
read
mind.
it in English.
No, I don't mind, unless you're feeling kind of super party up there.
No.
You have nothing to do. Okay. All right, so here's an interesting one. There are quite a few projects looking to wipe the internet slate clean. Carnegie Mellon, with its 100 by 100 Clean Slate project, Stanford University, the Genie Network, and the FIND program from the National Science Foundation. Here in Europe, there's something called FIRE, F-I-R-E project. There's Planet Lab, there's Wind Lab, and they all seem rather experimental, which is true. That's exactly what they are. Then Japan has the New Generation Network, scheduled to be up and running in the year 2020. I have to take a little detour here and say that that's 12 years from now. Anyone who thinks they can predict anything that's going to happen in the net 12 years from now is smoking something. You cannot predict. Try to go back 10 years ago and predict. 1998. Think about 1998 and think about what you know now about the internet. It's very hard to predict any of the things that are happening. Some trends, yes, like the increased speed and mobility and so on. But specifics, impossible. So how far really are these projects from becoming true? Is our current internet really coming to an end? How many years will be expected for migration? Are public carriers likely to embrace migration? Okay, so the real answer here is that the internet is evolving. It always has been. New protocols have been invented. The World Wide Web came along in around 1991, which from my point of view was about 18 years after the basic design was done. And after the HTTP and HTTPS and HTML got defined for the World Wide Web, that became a platform and more things were put up on top of that. You started to see Java code being downloaded into the browsers, making for more flexibility and, of course, more danger. We're seeing other kinds of protocols, like real-time protocols, coming onto the network. So all these things are happening at the same time. They're happening on a continuous basis. So some people say, is Internet 2 the next generation of Internet? And the answer is no. It's just another experiment. Some people say, is it really worth going back and starting over again? Or at least thinking about it? And the answer is yes. And there are some reasons for that. We've learned something about how the internet works. We've learned how people use it. We've seen how it keeps changing and expanding and growing, it's very interesting to go back and say, what would we do differently if we had the choice? I know what I would do. If it were 1977 and I had, again, the choice to make how big is the address space, I would pick 128 bits instead of 32. At the time, it would have been silly, because the backbone of the network was running at 50,000 bits per second. The access speeds were 1,200 bits per second if you were lucky. And having 256 bits used up for address space, source and destination, would be crazy. On the other hand, it would be nice not to have to go through the V4, V6 transition. Similarly, authentication. There isn't any authentication really in the net. It is not built in. You don't really know who you're talking to on the other end at any layer of protocol. You don't know what host it is. You don't know if it's a fake IP address when the packet arrives. You're not sure whose email you're getting because the email is not authenticated. So if we could build in authentication into the net, it would make a big difference. And that's another thing I would go back and look at. There's another reason for taking another look, if only just to learn something. There are things that we could not do 30 years ago because we didn't have enough memory, we didn't have enough computing power, the transmission rates were too low. There were all kinds of parameters that inhibited our ability to do things 30 years ago or even 20 years ago that we can do today. So there were ideas that would have been silly to do then but make sense to do now. Just like the streaming video and streaming audio today makes sense, but it wouldn't have made much sense 20 or 30 years ago. So it's worth just going back to see what we could do differently today if we had the choice. Actually implementing it and getting it to deploy is a whole other story. We can see how hard it's been to get IPv6 up and running. It's taken over 10 years. The IPv6 address, or the IPv6 structure, data structure, was standardized in 1996. And here it is 12 years later, and we are just beginning to get people to migrate into it. And it's only because they now recognize they're going to run out of room, or they'll run out of address space. And without the threat of exhausting the V4 address space, they wouldn't bother. So I'm actually encouraging these clean slate approaches to the design of the internet just to see what comes out. What could you do if you did it differently? Another example, radio. Today we use radio, we take the broadcast medium and we turn it into a point-to-point medium. Wi-Fi, for example, you build point-to-point links through, and yet, if you think about it, a radio is radiating, multiple sites can hear what's been transmitted. Sometimes that's really valuable because you want to share the same information with a large number of people. And it's very cheap to transmit once and have lots of people pick up the signal. That's what broadcast television is about. That's what broadcast satellite is about. And yet the internet protocols are not well oriented towards broadcast media. We have multicast, but it doesn't work very well, and it's too complicated. So if I were going back and saying, what else would I do differently? One thing I would do is to introduce into the internet protocols broadcast capability for those times when it is available. So that if I'm delivering large files of the same material, whether it's entertainment video or a program or something else, I can transmit that data simultaneously to a large number of receivers. And if they miss a packet or two, on a one-on-one basis, I can recover by retransmission. So I think these are very healthy projects. We don't know what will happen if they come up with new ideas. Will anyone implement them? The answer is, I don't know. You have to convince the commercial sector that this particular feature is worth implementing. In the case of V6, it's worth implementing because otherwise you run out of addresses. But some of the other applications, not so clear. Okay, so I'm in favor of this. The fourth question has to do with the current state of the interplanet network. This is the interplanetary internet. Is it still going on, and is it actually going to happen? I've been reporting on this for 10 years. The project started at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena in 1998. And the theory that my colleagues and I had there is that the networking that has been used to support space exploration has been very weak over this period from about 1964 to the present. We use something called the Deep Space Network with the big 70-meter dishes, one of which is in Madrid, one is in Canberra, Australia, and one in Goldstone, California, to communicate with spacecraft that are out in the solar system, some of them orbiting around the planets, some of them landing on the surface of a planet, and some of them flying past the asteroids. The problem with point-to-point radio links is that they're quite limited. If you don't have line of sight between the two systems, you have no communication. And there are a lot of conditions in space communication where there is not a line of sight connection. If you're on the surface of a planet, for example, and the planet's rotating, you can't communicate with Earth until you get around in the rotation. Or maybe the satellites around the planet are occluded, they hide behind the planet until they come back around in their orbit. So the communication is broken a lot in the space environment. So what we decided to do at JPL is to develop a new suite of protocols that would deal with the disruption in communication in deep space and also deal with the delay. This is something you can't do anything about. The speed of light is what it is, at least according to Einstein. And you can't make it go faster or slower, setting aside some interesting theories that the speed of light may actually have changed over time, but we'll leave it as a constant for this discussion. The problem is that the distance between the planets is so big that it takes a measurably long period of time for a signal to propagate. Example, when Earth and Mars are farthest apart in their orbits, it takes 20 minutes one way for a radio wave to propagate, and of course another 20 minutes to come back. The TCP/IP protocols do not tolerate that kind of delay. Flow control just doesn't work. It's very simple. You know, in TCP, when you run out of room, you say stop to the other guy. And as long as you're in a terrestrial environment, that only takes a few hundred milliseconds, and that's fine. You can buffer the bits that are coming at you before the other side hears you say stop. But what if you're on Mars and you say stop while you're on Earth? The guy on Mars doesn't hear you for 20 minutes, and he keeps transmitting data, and you don't know what to do with it. It's all falling on the floor. So we need new kinds of flow control. We need to deal with the disruption. So we actually developed a whole new suite of protocols over this past 10-year period called Delay and Disruption Tolerant Networking, or DTN for short. We've implemented that protocol. We have refined it several times. We have done testing terrestrially with the protocols in very hostile environments. One experiment that we did in the northern part of Sweden with the reindeer herders, the Sami reindeer herders, is to put the Wi-Fi transmitter in the villages and Wi-Fi transmitters in all-terrain vehicles using the DTN protocol. So as they wander into the village, they pick up information, they deliver information, and then they go on their way. It's kind of like a little mule that's carrying information, dropping things off and picking it up, and we even call these data mules. So the protocol worked very well for that kind of casual interaction. Then, because the U.S. Defense Department supported the work of the interplanetary protocols, we said to them we thought it would also work well in tactical communication, where you have a lot of disruption, you have jamming and other things. So we tested it with the American Marine Corps in tactical environments. The DTN protocols delivered 10 times more data than TCP/IP did under these hostile conditions. And so it worked so well, in fact, that they took all my experimental equipment with them. Then they just went off with it, and I said, wait a minute, it's an experiment. And they said, no, it isn't, and off they went. So we're very confident from the terrestrial testing that these new protocols are very robust. At the end of this year, we're going to upload the DTN protocols to the Deep Impact spacecraft, which is in orbit around the sun. It was used a couple of years ago to impact a comet and to analyze the interior that blew out from the implosion. That same platform is still available, and NASA has given us permission to use it to do deep space testing of the DTN protocols. In the meantime, last Sunday, Some of you know that the Phoenix Mars lander successfully arrived at Mars. I was very excited about this because I was at JPL on Sunday in the operations center watching this whole process happening. And it's nerve-wracking because you know when the spacecraft was supposed to have landed on the surface. The trouble is you can't hear anything about it for another 15 minutes because of the radio propagation delay. And so we're sitting here knowing that either it landed or it crashed, and we don't know until 15 minutes later we get the signal, the parachute is deployed, and the signal that says the retro rocket is fired, and the signal that says I'm touching the surface and the motor has been turned off. And finally, pictures. So you saw all the pictures. You also may have seen some reports that we ran into some communication problems for a few hours just recently, and they got resolved. That was, scary. But the protocols that are being used in that deep space, in the Phoenix lander, are not from the lander direct to Earth. We're going up to the satellites, the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter and Mars Express, and it's being relayed just like the internet, store and forward through the deep space net. So we're now demonstrating with the Phoenix lander, and we're demonstrating with the rovers that store and forward communication is actually more powerful, more flexible than the traditional point-to-point links. This is really exciting for us, my team at JPL, because we think that by standardizing on these richer protocols, we will allow scientists to invent much more complex missions than they could support otherwise. So for example, they could send sensors down on the surface of the planet. The sensors could use radios to self-organize, use the DTN protocols for exchanging information and relaying up to the orbiters for further transmission. Or you could have multiple platforms flying in tandem, doing interferometry, optical and otherwise, or radio interferometry, using the DTN protocols to communicate locally. So just last month, I went to Heidelberg, Germany to meet at a conference of the space operations people all around the world from each of the space-faring countries, Japan, Russia, China, the US, and so on. ESA, the European Space Agency, to talk about standardizing the protocols. And there was a very, very positive response that came back from that. So the answer to this question is the interplanetary project is in very good shape right now. We are demonstrating capabilities, and by this time next year, we will have not only the deep impact experience, but we're also putting the protocols on the International Space Station. So we will be in a position by 2009 to propose full standardization for all the space-faring countries. And I hope the new missions during the second decade of the 21st century will carry the DTN protocols on board. Okay, a few more questions. Well, how are we doing on time, by the way?
Well, maybe, I think that there are some other questions more engineering-like.
Yes, okay.
And we could leave the others because we don't have time. And we'll have some time for people to ask you questions here that may be interesting. So maybe I choose either the next one or the 7th one, like you want. I don't know what you think.
Which one do you have in mind? Anything in particular? Number
this is related
5?
to regional applications, and this is about interpretation.
All right, so let's look at that. Okay.
Well, I didn't translate correctly this term because it's not safe port, it's safe harbor. I don't know exactly, I don't remember exactly the
Oh, I see, safe harbor instead of safe port.
You know what I mean.
So this, I do. This is a question about Google's data protection policy, and the claim that's being made here is that it does not match Spanish or European laws for data protection. I actually don't believe that to be the case. So this could be a difference of opinion. I had understood that we are using the safe harbor rules for for data protection for information which is outside of Europe, but which might be related to personal information in Europe of European citizens. So the assertion that we don't follow the safe harbor rules in this question, I believe, is not correct. In any case, my sense is that safe harbor is a sensible way of dealing with the issue of data protection, because you have to have some commonality on an international basis. Now, Google has asked, however, that there be attention paid to a common sense of privacy. There is not a common global attitude about what is private information and what is not private. And it's becoming quite difficult for Google to satisfy every different definition of what is private information and how is it to be protected. So Google has asked in different venues for there to be work done on common global definition of what is private information. And I'm not sure where that's going to go in the end, but I can say that the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development has a meeting coming up in the middle of June in Korea next month. I'll be there along with others to talk about that particular problem, among other things. Also, the Internet Governance Forum, which will meet in Hyderabad at the end of the year, is going to almost certainly have to discuss this same question. So Google is looking for ways of getting more global agreement on what is private information and how it should be handled, because it's very hard to implement different policies in different countries, particularly in our case. If you look at the Google network of data centers, the data centers are scattered around the world, and information from various sources is distributed throughout that system. And so there isn't any natural way of confining European information in the data centers that are in Europe. The whole idea here is to distribute the information in order to increase resilience of the data system. So if, for example, your email, if you're using Google Mail or Gmail, you really want Google to replicate the information. So if a particular data center isn't available, maybe a big power failure, you can still get to your data, but that data may be somewhere else in the world. You really don't want to say, oh, I don't want my data to show up in that country, because I don't like their data protection rules. What you want is for a common set of protections to be applied no matter where the data happens to be. Otherwise, you wind up with an unimplementable combination of too many permutations of rules and locations for the data to exist. So anyway, on that one, I thought that we are already following the safe harbor, but if we aren't, it's probably because we're interested in getting commonality on a global scale. The other question had to do with, number 5, right? The presentation layer.
Reaching or application.
This says the presentation layer is falling behind with respect to other net layers. Will rich internet applications like Adobe Flex, Microsoft Silverlight, or Java FX succeed, and could they change dramatically the current internet? Well, we really are faced with a lot of different representations of data right now. Google is very interested in seeing more agreement among the various players about representation of information. There's a very strong reason for that. I have been trying to expose to everyone, and tomorrow when I'm lecturing in the Honoris Causa ceremonies, I'm going to focus very much on this problem of data representation. I'm very concerned that the applications we use are building very, very complex digital objects. When you think about a spreadsheet, it's a very complicated kind of data. And unless you have the software that is associated with that spreadsheet, it's just a big pile of bits and they don't mean anything. Imagine for a moment that it is now the year 3000 and you've just done a Google search and you pulled up a 1997 PowerPoint file. And let's even pretend that you're using Windows 3000. The question is, does Windows 3000 know how to interpret a 1,000-year-old data file? And the answer is probably no. This is also a problem even with open source, because for even an open source package to have backward compatibility over a 1,000-year period is very unlikely. We can't even make backward compatibility work over a 10-year period, let alone 1,000 years. So we need to figure out how to deal with this problem. I've been labeling it the bit rot problem, because the bits that you accumulate after a while rot if you can't interpret them. So this is not just Google's problem, this is everybody's problem. We may need to find a way to preserve the programs that have been used to create certain kinds of files. And the company that has invented that software, if it's proprietary, and then says, oh, we're not going to support that anymore, it's too old, we may need to find rules that say, okay, if you're going to stop support, you need to make that software available on the net somehow, so that people with the old files can still use that software. And you may need to retain not only the software that makes the files and interprets them, you may need to retain the operating system that that program ran on. And you might even have to maintain an emulation of the hardware that the operating system ran on, that ran the application that could interpret the bits of the file. We don't have any rules right now for that kind of practice. And if we don't find a solution to the problem, 100 years from now, the people of the year 2108 are going to wonder, what were the people in 2008 doing, because they can't read any of our files. They can't read our emails, they can't read our texts, they can't run the spreadsheets, they can't even look at the video. Some of you probably already are finding that image files are not always interpretable as you move from one computer to another. I had the problem that showed up just recently with a PowerPoint file that was prepared in a Macintosh using Microsoft's Macintosh PowerPoint software. And then I went to a PC that was running Microsoft's PowerPoint software, and I tried to show this particular PowerPoint, and at one point a big window opened up saying, we're very sorry, but we don't have any software to interpret this format of bits, and so, you know, that slide is broken. And, you know, my natural reaction was to pick up the phone and call Bill Gates or, you know, Steve Ballmer or something. And I don't mean, by the way, I don't mean to pick on Microsoft here. This is a serious problem for everyone. It's a problem even with open source. So we need to start paying a lot of attention to that. It's going to, it is not going to solve the problem of people with different kinds of user interfaces and different kinds of files trying to communicate with each other. The only way to solve that is to have more agreed commonality of representation. And that's going to take some hard work. And you're going to discover over time that people will explore new kinds of applications with new kinds of formats, and you don't want to stop that. That's how you discover new ways to use the net. But there will always be pressure in the background to make things more common, to interwork. And that's been the history of the net since the beginning, is you start out with new ideas and new things that give you an edge, and then you realize that you want more ability to interwork with everyone else. So I think we still have some work ahead. Those of you who are looking for PhD dissertations should have heard at least a half dozen opportunities in this discussion for some serious hard work. So let me stop with the predetermined questions. I'm happy to try to answer other questions if you have them.
Please. Is there any question?
Just a week ago, an Indian guy was Google helped the Indian police to apprehend an Indian guy that because he had posted.
I'm sorry, I know you're asking this question in English, but I can't hear you very well.
Maybe we could use
No,
Here's
we're going to, we're going to do this.
One.
You know how we do this? This is how we do this. I'm going to come where I can. I'm hearing impaired, okay, so I don't want to be the guy that came to talk and didn't listen. So sometimes I have to do that. Okay, question.
Just a week ago, Google helped the United authorities to apprehend a young guy who had posted
Well, this is in India, recently. Yeah. And the question is, why did we do that?
Right. Well, I understand the reasons.
Okay.
I would like to know the reason on this.
Okay, so the real issue here is what to do about operating with applications in countries where the government or the police, the law enforcement wants the service provider to reveal where did the information come from. And Google has a policy of following the rules and the law in any country where it's operating. It would be stupid to have a business model that says, our business model is to break the law where we don't like the laws. It's not a good way to run a business. Particularly if you have people in the country, because then they end up going to jail. And it's not very productive when you're in jail. So we follow the law. We deliberately do not offer services, however, where we are afraid that we would be put in between the law enforcement and the users. So, for example, in China, where we were criticized for operating in China at all, we did not offer services that would put us into this awkward position. So we didn't offer Gmail, we didn't offer blogging, because we didn't want the government to say to us, we have information that we want. We said, no, we don't, because we don't offer those services. Other companies have offered a broader. Does that mean I should stop? By the way, whoever had the camera here has a problem. It's talking to the chair. So anyway, I don't know what to do about that. I should go back here and say goodbye. I'm sorry. I'm running around out in front of the audience. Okay, so this is still working, huh? Yeah, all right. So why are you messing with that so much? So anyway, in India, however, we do offer. Okay, are we having a contest about who can make the most noise?
No, I was trying to fix this one so that you could answer from this here.
I see.
And we could use
I have to go around lip reading anyway, so this is fine. I like this one.
Right.
This is called technical terms. So in India, we do offer the services like blogging, email, and so on. And so it turns out that there, the law enforcement actually has very, very powerful privileges to demand information from internet application providers like us. And they did all the proper things, and so we provided the information. We've had similar issues like this coming up in Brazil with Orchid, the social networking system, and we've been very resistant to what we consider improper demands, but as long as they follow all the legal requirements, then we have to respond. In the United States, for example, there was a situation where a court case, which didn't directly involve Google, between two other parties involved the effectiveness of filtering at the edges of the net to protect children from inappropriate material. And so in the course of this legal proceeding, a demand was placed, it's called a subpoena. The demand was placed on Google to provide a week's worth of query and the responses. A whole week. I mean, this is hundreds of millions of queries. It's a huge amount of data. And we refused on the grounds that the court didn't have standing to demand that information from us. We were very concerned that if we responded to that, it might, first of all, expose the privacy of people whose privacy we should protect. But also, even if it didn't directly expose anyone's privacy, we didn't want to respond to that particular demand, only to have another one come, which did, in fact, set of responses which we didn't think compromised anything. So you're touching, the question though touches on this general problem of the acceptable behaviors in each of our societies, sometimes within a country, and sometimes even inside of the country. We have different communities that have different views of what's acceptable behavior and what isn't. And we're going to have to struggle to find some reasonable accommodation to deal with the different views of acceptable community behavior. As the internet ties us closer together on a global scale, it's going to force us on a global scale to come to grips with what we want our society to be like. And as much as you might want to say, well, I don't care what anyone else thinks, somehow we have to care what everyone else thinks because we're more connected now than we ever were. Okay, other questions? Yes, let me take this one in back.
Yes, in the same line, you have said that you brought more identification in the network.
Yes, authentication, yes.
Okay, I think this is a bad idea just because the same thing that you
Yes, what do we do about that?
If you make
Yes.
a darknet
Yes.
and let people who in confidence about what they think, I think it would be a better idea than that.
Okay, so there's three different things that this question touches on. So let me try to remember all three of them in response. Authentication can be extremely valuable when you're having an interaction and you want to be sure that you know what you're interacting with and who you're interacting with. So for example, if you're going to a banking website, you really want to make sure it's your bank that you're talking to and not some phishing site. If you're having a personal exchange with someone in email, it would be nice if you could be sure that it's your friend that you're talking to and not someone who's pretending. So that says strong authentication would be a good thing. On the other hand, what we were just talking about says that if you had to always identify yourself, no matter what transaction you did, now you would feel inhibited. Sometimes people would like to go search for information and they really don't want to say who they are or why they're looking for the information. Sometimes you want to say things that you think need to be said, but you don't necessarily want to say who you are. Maybe you might be in a country where if you said that, you would be in a lot of trouble. So we have this tension. My view, the way I resolve